Good morning. I'm John Pavlik, a professor in the Department of Journalism and Media Studies here at the School of Communication and Information at Rutgers University. And I'm delighted to be the moderator for this opening panel. I thank our speakers, which will start with Stephen Lacy, who's professor of journalism at Michigan State University, followed by Rodney Benson, who is associate professor in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication at New York University, and finally, Dean Gracie Lawson-Borders, who is Dean of the School of Communication at Howard University. So I'll introduce each speaker a little more fully before they speak, but we'll hold off your questions until the conclusion of their three presentations, which will be about 15 minutes each. So before I introduce Stephen Lacy, though, let me just offer a couple of comments about the topic for this opening panel, which I think is such a critically important one. Journalism and journalism research, I think, are in ferment, driven by so many changes, technological changes, economic changes, cultural shifts, so many forces that are reshaping what we're here about today. And the question of, what is the meaning of quality journalism? How do we measure it? I think fundamentally important. Mr. Daggett already pointed out, the Rolling Stone piece. And so, for the public, many times we think the key thing in journalism is the telling of the story, the words, what's presented to the public. But as that case points out, the foundation really is the reporting. The journalists have to go into the field in a variety of ways, get the facts, and that's where the quality begins in many ways, and that's where many times it falls apart. So, that's a big part of this. Also, something that's changing fundamentally in many ways, the growing amount of citizen reporting that flows into the journalism of today. We can't just talk about professionals who work in journalism and are paid for their work, but also citizens often become a part of this as well. We've seen this just very recently out of North Charleston, where that citizen-produced video, which he shot in some ways at his own peril, he could have been become part of the story in another way too. So there's so many things that are changing in this field today. So I think this is a wonderful way to start. And our first speaker, Stephen Lacy, will really address this directly, with this topic being defining and measuring quality journalism. So, Professor Lacy, as I mentioned, is a professor of journalism at Michigan State University. He's published widely on this topic with 100 refereed journal articles, more than 60 refereed conference papers, 10 book chapters, and 4 books. He's been a specialist, especially in the realm of content analysis, which speaks directly to the core of quality journalism. His Analyzing Media Messages is in its 3rd edition. It's really shaping what students understand about this field. He's co-edited 2 other books. He formerly co-edited the Journal of Media Economics. He received his PhD in journalism from the University of Texas at Austin, and has worked on multiple large-scale content analysis projects involving a wide range of media. His projects have had wide support from industry and foundations, the Knight Foundation, the Pew Foundation, the National Science Foundation. He's been recognized for his work widely with the Paul J. Deutschman Award for Excellence in Research, which is a career award from the Association for Journalism and Mass Communication Education. And he's served as director of the School of Journalism at Michigan State as well. So he comes to this both as someone who has studied quality journalism extensively, but also as a leader in the field, and he brings his own professional experience. Before he was a professor, he edited a group of suburban dailies in or near Dallas, Texas, and he's been a leader in the field. We're fortunate to have him this morning. Steve?
Okay. I'm a Mac person. I'll do my best. Okay. Well, maybe it's not good enough. Okay. Okay, there we go. And all right, where is? Yay, Katie! Hook 'em horns. I want to start by simply saying, while Katie's taking care of this, Phil, Jack, Chris, Tom, thank you all for putting this on. It's after spending 3 decades of trying to figure out how to measure journalism. Number one, it's great that you're doing this. Number two, thank you for including me. Number three, I hope to learn a lot today. Now, this slide has nothing to do with my presentation, but we're rebranding, and I like the slide. So thought I would start with that. Tom Rosenstiel, who sends his regrets, he can't be here. He runs American Press Institute, and we're charged with doing this gigantic sort of literature review. And after I worked my way through my dissertation flashbacks, we were able to finish something which you have. It's somewhat long, but that simply reflects what's there. So most of what I want to do today, because I'm an academic, I'm going to start with questions and end with questions. And in between, we'll talk a little bit about classification systems and some of the results we found. I remember a few years ago in a class, students arguing over whether or not citizen journalism was journalism. And so they went on for, 15, 20, 30 minutes, I don't know. Seemed like forever. And finally I said, depends on how you define journalism. So many of our arguments come down to what we mean by a particular term. So Tom and I wanted to start out with this definition, which is really broad, but that's good. We want this to be inclusive. There are some things that you could argue are left out, and I prefer to argue over beer, but we can do that today if you like.
I will be here at the reception.
Okay, all right, we'll wait and save that then. So this is sort of the definition we started out with. It emphasizes all sorts of information, etc. It will become clearer as we go through the rest of the presentation just what that really means. Why is quality journalism important? Well, Chris has already referred to that, so he sort of stole that thunder, but Pulitzer said, our republic and its press will rise or fall together. More academic, if we increase the quality of journalism, it will lead better decisions by citizens and more accountable government. There's an even easier way to say this, and that's simply to say the First Amendment. That's why quality is important. I think all of us pretty much agree with that, most of us, because that's why we're here. Why do we need to measure quality? There are lots of reasons. I'll start with the idea that if we want to improve journalism and journalism education, we need to be able to test what we do. All of you in academia know accessibility, assessment, all of these things. It's important, even if it's a very simple measure of classifying things into groups. We need to be able to say this is better than this if we're going to be able to study how to change things. So I've always thought, which is why I've been doing this for a long time, the question is not can we measure quality, the question is how well can we measure quality? And it varies tremendously across measures. I discovered that recently when I read all of these articles. So, what is quality journalism? Now, I thought about putting up a really pithy answer here and we'd all go home. But since we're really here to talk about this, I want to start with the idea of thinking about how quality is determined. So I went back to the individual. I think what happens is that something has quality when we value it. And value starts with our beliefs. And then quality journalism comes from the rational, emotional engagement with that content. Both of those things are important. The cognitive processing, say I can interpret for academics, rational thinking, and the emotional impact. Both of those things. But it's important that we understand it begins from a belief system. So you can believe that journalism should be what I agree with. And to you, that becomes quality, right? And so this is why we have different perceptions of what generates quality. Now, those of us who teach and have done journalism understand that when we work in those groups, we share our beliefs. We socialize each other. We learn that these things represent quality, etc. So moving from this process in our heads to measuring, I think, is the task that many of us are interested in. Okay, so now we're going to sort of jump over into the idea of classifying journalism and trying to figure out this. And so Tom and I decided there are at least two, probably more, but these are the two that stood out in our literature review for defining journalism. First of all, there's sort of a level of evaluation. You can evaluate individual units, an article. Man, that was a great story, right? The rest of it was crap, but that was a great story. Okay, so you can evaluate content units, content bundles. Some people like to call them products. Some people call them newspapers. Some people call them newscasts. But that's when you take individual units and you put them together. Right? You can evaluate media type. we have, well, depending on what sort of classification you want, we have lots of different ways of presenting, lots of different media. And you don't evaluate them all the same. Last night, I checked into the University Inn, turned on the TV, and I mentioned to someone this morning there are tornadoes hitting central Illinois, which is where one of my daughters lives. So I spent my time watching this tornado chaser, following, thinking, God, what a terrible job. What if it turns around? Now, that was of high quality at that point, and there's no way in the world I would try to evaluate that with the articles I read in my local newspaper, New York Times, that morning. Different media have different standards for evaluating quality. We can also look at journalism organizations. You can evaluate everything that the New York Times puts out, or BuzzFeed, or the Lansing State Journal, Asbury Park Press, any of the organizations that produce. You can evaluate the journalism on that level, if you want. Finally, there's the entire system. It could be a community, a market, whatever. And Chris sort of mentioned, I think, the desert of coverage. Well, it's interesting. 6 years ago, we did a big study, and we looked at more than 800 news organizations from like 150 metropolitan areas in the country. We were looking at how our local governments covered. A couple of things that leaped out at us is, number one, we looked at metros and the suburban areas. If you are a city and you do not have a news organization, an outlet in that city, your city government will not receive regular coverage. Period. Just doesn't happen. It's that desert you referred to. We also looked at county coverage, and that's practically non-existent on a regular basis anywhere in the country. You find a few areas, big metropolitan areas, where county was important, maybe some small areas where they cared a lot. But we were struck by the absence in so many areas of local government coverage. In other words, if you got nothing, you got no quality to begin with. And there are large areas of the country who have that experience right now. So the point is that if you want to think about quality, you can go in and you have to look at it at these different layers, these different levels. And they may or may not share standards for quality. You can think about, well, if you want to measure the bundle, you can simply measure each unit and add it up. And that has some advantages and disadvantages. The second one is the idea of perception. You sort of need to pick a point. Now, here are 6 common sort of perceptions we ran across in looking at literature. The top 5 are pretty much all connected because they deal with journalism. Right? Journalists, educators, academic scholars who may or may not be educators of journalism, media critics, journalism outlet managers. We need a better term. I was telling Jerry this morning, we need a better term of referring to news organizations, right? I use news organizations, news outlets. Newspapers, the term means nothing anymore at a newspaper. It's not a newspaper anymore. It's a news multimedia outlet, whatever. But gets back to the point that we have sort of 2 groups, and then we've got consumers. There's not as much variance in these top 5 when it comes to perspectives about quality. At least that's what we found. And I'm going to give you some common sort of things that stand out amongst that group. But when you get to the consumers, there are some people who don't want to engage in government at all. So what they want is entertainment. There are some people who all they want is something that agrees with them. There are some people who want to enjoy serendipity, sort of stumble across stories that they might not have seen before. There are all of these different motives and ways of looking at quality of news amongst the consumers. Doesn't mean it can't be studied, doesn't mean it can't be measured, just means it's difficult. But we all need to make a living, so that's a good thing if you're a scholar. Okay, so consistently out of all this, Tom and I found these sorts of elements that were considered to be quality. They're very vague because when you go through all these articles and you try and find common threads, it becomes vague. First of all is the idea of presentation quality. Now, high production values, by that we mean anything ranging from someone who spells correctly and uses good grammar in writing to video that's easy to see and understand and not grainy and et cetera. Accessibility. So how you present things is an important part of it. Trustworthiness. Inaccurate information is not very useful to anyone. It leads you to make bad decisions. Credibility. If you don't trust someone, you're not going to believe them. Simple as that. Diversity. And this is diversity in a wide-ranging way of thinking about it. Numbers of sources, types of sources, issues, topics, ideas, all of those things. We are an extremely diverse society, a country. You can't deal with the issues facing that country without dealing with all the diversity that's in it. Depth and breadth of information. Now, you'll notice a lot of these things are sort of connected. By that, we're talking more about the information about a particular topic or trend. I have a recently retired colleague at Michigan State who spent his 30-year career studying coverage of state legislatures. And he would do studies, and then he would talk to the journalists that he studied. Sit down and say, here's what we found. What do you think? And what they consistently said is that when you look at the unit, you're not going to understand the depth and the breadth that we do. You've got to look at all of our coverage. And, of course, he said, not everybody does that. Well, that's another issue. So it's how much depth and breadth you have about issues. And that's something that really involves time when you come to journalism. It's not something that happens in any particular unit of content. Comprehensiveness, again, cover the range of important community events and issues. Public affairs. Basically, we're talking about civics, which is what it was called when I was young, government. This is something that is at the heart of journalism. It's the reason for studying quality. And then, of course, geographic relevance. Now, that's not just local, 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 which is a mantra that's been going around for the past 40 years. That's important. And in many local places, you don't get any coverage at all. But it's the relevant geographic news for your audience. So, if you want to know international, there are particular places you go. If you want to know about Ingham County, Michigan, there are particular places you go. But it's important that we recognize the geography because we're still tied to geography because it's tied to governments. Okay, so those are consistent qualities. Real quickly now, sort of approaches towards measuring. There are a couple. One is, and this goes back to those perspectives, the demand side and the production side. Production side, we learn what the standards are supposed to be, right? Demand side, there's a lot of variance. Academic and professional. In 30 years, I've spent a lot of time working with academic and professionals, and what I found is academics are interested more in the abstract in general. Professionals are more interested in solving that problem, sometimes of the day or the week or the next budget, etc. Now, that means we sometimes approach things differently, but we're not totally exclusive in our interest. Methods of measuring, and this is from an article, actually turned out to be a very nice little classification system. Direct measurement of content, content analysis. There are many ways of doing that. It's been happening over the years. You can measure all sorts of things depending upon whether or not you think they're important. Audience preference. Traditionally, this was done with surveys. Now it's being done with tracking data. And this is a tremendous thing. I wish Tom was here because API has a system working with newspapers now where they basically classified content into categories and then they're tracking what people are, how they're using it, when they're using it, et cetera. So they're going to get a lot of good data about audience preference. So to some degree, digital has increased that tremendously. Expert judgment. Research has used a lot of panels of experts, journalists. There was one study that actually used Pulitzer Prizes to see if competitive markets resulted in more Pulitzer Prizes in that market. So there are a whole range of expert judgment. I once did in 1993, the CEO of Thomson newspaper made a speech and said, quote, we produce crappy newspapers. And so we took that as a quality measure. And so we actually did a study where we compared Thomson with a randomly selected ordinary set of American newspapers to see what happened to those two groups over a decade. And sure enough, Thomson saw a tremendous decline in penetration and circulation, and we matched and we controlled statistically. So the odds were the only reason it happened is because of Thomson. And I actually talked to the guy there, and he said, well, you know, we're making 18%. We want to make in the mid-20s, and we think we can turn that around. And 3 years later, Thomson sold all their newspapers because they weren't able to turn it around. They unfortunately couldn't make 25% profit margins. And all they had to do is look at that trend data and, you know, figure that out. But anyway, so even CEOs can be experts in this situation. Indirect measures. There is an approach where you look at the input rather than trying to measure the output because the output is difficult. And interestingly enough, the studies have indicated that there is a correlation. If you do invest, things get better. It's not perfect. But there's also a lot of recent, unfortunately, about newspapers in the old sense, research about investment in the newsroom being the most important thing in terms of producing profit and circulation. more important than investment in the advertising department. So interesting stuff that's going on. But these are different ways of approaching. Real quick, things that we learn. There's a significant body that already exists. The good news is if you want to think about measuring, you don't have to start at zero. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done, but not at zero. There are very few multiple method studies, for example, like they're doing at API, content analysis and audience preference. We ran across a few, and they tended to be consistent in that those 7 things that we listed tended to keep popping up in those studies. A lot of studies about the relationship between quality measures and variables that are consistent, let's say, with economic theory, and they are consistent. So if you have competition, the tendency is to invest in order to differentiate your product. One way is by making it better. Doesn't guarantee it'll become better, but that is one approach that's been taken. Last and most importantly is there are very few articles out there that have really addressed, in terms of measurement, quality of digital media. So there's the frontier, and again, there are places that are trying to get into that. Okay, so lots of questions. Finish up with these things to think about. What measures can be developed for determining the quality of journalism's contribution to the community? A lot of stuff about, individual articles and clumps like this, but looking at the overall community. What's the impact in the well-being of the civic community? There's just not a lot out there. I think it can be done. There have been efforts. Things like diversity is an area Phil looks at. That's a huge element of it. The FCC has been trying to dip its toe into this water, and diversity is always in it. So how do we do this? How do we measure the group dynamic, the group impact? Can measures developed for newspapers, television be applied to news delivered through mobile internet? I don't think mobile and internet has done away with the old forms of journalism. They still work. It's that we got new forms. I was in newspapers when we moved to computers in the newsroom, and I was young then. I wasn't conservative, right? So I was delighted. This was wonderful. This was the greatest thing since sliced bread. We could edit better. We could write better. We could do all of these things because we had computers. That's what we've got to look at in the future. Mobile, the internet will make it better. Different, but better. Okay. Visual communication, interactivities. How do we measure quality of all these new tools that are there? If consumers disagree with journalists about characters of quality, how do journalists adjust and react? One of the downsides of becoming a profession, if you will, is that we wanted to be more like doctors and lawyers than service people. There's a great quote from E.W. Scripps when he was building the labor newspapers around the country. He wrote to his editors, he said, hire young men and don't pay them very much. They'll have to live with the people they write for. Sort of tough, but it's not a bad idea. You should understand the people that you're supposed to serve, and journalism in the end is a service industry. Okay, to what end do we use measures of journalism? You can use measures to downgrade quality. That's always a possibility. If you can measure it and understand how it's created, you can always use it in the other direction. So to what end do we use these? What causes variations in consumer preferences and perceptions? We really don't know that very well. And that's something that we've got to understand to adjust to market changes. Are these elements we listed, these 7, the most important? What others are there? Are some of these really not important after all? I mean, all of these are questions that I hope we end up talking about either directly or indirectly today, and that over the next few years we look into and try and solve. So thank you very much. I appreciate your attention.
Well, thank you, Professor Lacy, for providing us with a very useful framework for understanding both the meaning and the measurement of quality journalism, especially the kind of questions that we should be exploring as we go into this digital age. So I'm delighted to introduce our next panelist, Rodney Benson, Associate Professor in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication at New York University. Professor Benson is especially known for his work in the arena of international aspects on journalism and media. He's the author of Shaping Immigration News, a French-American comparison, which is also the winner of the 2014 AEJMC Tankard Book Award. He's editor with Frank Neveu of Bordeaux in the journalistic field. He co-author with Matthew Powers of Public Media and Political Independence, Lessons for the Future of Journalism from Around the World. He's working on a new book, How Media Ownership Matters, and it'll be drawing on a variety of materials to look at beyond the standard idea and debate about media concentration to explore how different forms of media ownership can affect the type and quality of journalism. And I think this international perspective that he provides is so important in the context of understanding quality journalism, so we can move beyond just, say, a U.S. perspective, but really understand how this is situated in an increasingly global digital age. So his work as well, he's highly connected to public policy and the media. Before he pursued his academic career, he was the chief speechwriter for U.S. Senator Tom Harkin, and his work has appeared in a variety of publications and outlets, whatever we call them, around the world, including Le Monde Diplomatique, AlJazeera.com, and the Miami Herald. So Professor Lacy will explore where to find quality journalism. Mr. Benson, thank you.
Thank you, John. Let's see if we can get started here. As you'll see, I think I'm going to arrive at some of the same places as Steve did in that very interesting presentation, but by a slightly different route. So as John mentioned, my research, I assume I was invited because of my research on Europe. I've studied France, a lot of work recently in Scandinavian countries, so looking at Denmark and Norway and Sweden. So I want to, the title of my talk is Where to Find Quality Journalism. And I want to, in saying that, I'm really getting at that in what I mean by where in 4 different ways. One is like, what are our ideals of quality journalism? And secondly, where do we find it in terms of the content of news? Third, which types of media outlets and media systems? So, yeah, so there. Which types of media outlets and media systems are we most likely to find quality journalism? And then some other aspects that affect quality. I'll talk about news formats and audiences. Okay, so first of all, I think we need to be very clear about what's at stake here. And so I want to start not with the U.S. status quo, which is, internationally speaking, a hyper-commercial journalistic system, and really an outlier on the international stage. But I want to start with theories of democracy, because I think we can talk about news as entertainment or the aesthetic values, but I think mostly when we have these kinds of conversations, why do we care about this? We care about it because journalism fulfills certain needs for democracy, right? And so that's, I think, ultimately what's at stake. But what is democracy, right? That's a loaded term. But I think that we can say that there are multiple models of democracy that are rooted in political philosophy and in different kind of national civic traditions. And so I think we need to be, before we can even begin to answer the question of what is quality journalism, we have to be clear about what do we mean by democracy, right? And so these ideals that we have for democracy, they're cross-cutting, sometimes they're conflicting. But how we define quality clearly follows from how we define democracy. So Myra Marks-Ferry and colleagues, Bill Gampson at Boston and some German colleagues, did a study of the abortion debate in Germany and the United States in the early 2000s. And they draw on this, I'm drawing on their typology here, but they basically argue that there are 4 broad models of democracy, and that the first is the representative liberal. This is probably the closest to what most actually existing democracies have. It's we count on our representatives and we to represent us, and that it's not really a direct democracy. So that what we really want from journalism is to kind of keep an eye on the office holders and the elected officials, to provide in-depth information, to bring in expertise, to serve that watchdog role where they're criticizing the powerful. And that's one, and that's probably the dominant model in the U.S., but that's not the only model of democracy. We might also have a more participatory model of democracy where what we really care about is pluralism. We want diversity of voices and viewpoints. We want people to participate directly in democracy. This is really, this is a different model of democracy. We have different, it's difficult to sort of, to have all of these at once. So in a way, we have to decide what do we want to really prioritize. Third, a deliberative model. This draws on Habermas's work, where what we really care about is the kind of quality of debate, civil and reasoned debate. And so here this is really kind of brings out the tensions between these aspirations. If what we really care about is pluralism, we might have to compromise on that ideal of civility, right? That pluralism, the kind of shouting matches of Fox and MSNBC you could say they bring pluralism. And some of the website, the diversity of websites, they bring pluralism to the public debate, but they don't necessarily meet that deliberative ideal, right? And finally, a constructionist model drawing on the feminist critique, particularly of Habermas, that says, what's really important is that we bring in voices from the margins, that we not just privilege reasons, civil debate, but we also bring in personal narratives, and that we should allow for multiple communication styles. So these are different ideals, and how we define quality, I think, really has to start here. So next I want to just focus on a couple of examples of how I've tried to measure quality in my comparisons of the French and the U.S. media. So I'm just going to focus on pluralism, both internal and external. So Steve, I think, was getting out with this with some of his comments. Do we care about the pluralism, the diversity of viewpoints within the single news outlet or the single news article, or are we more interested in the diversity across the media system as a whole? And that would be more external pluralism. And secondly, criticism of the powerful. Okay. So this draws on my book, as John mentioned, Shaping Immigration News. So briefly in terms of my methodology, the case study was, I was looking at immigration news in France and the U.S. Over the past 40 years, I don't know if it's exactly the same year when Rutgers journalism was founded when I started, but around that time. And I'm looking at 10-plus news organizations across the two countries' newspapers and TV, commercial, as well as public, and smaller niche newspapers. My unit of analysis primarily was what I call the prominent news package, which would be the page one article in a newspaper and all the related articles inside, or the evening news in the case of TV. And my content analysis is the semiotic level is really at the manifest rather than the latent meaning level to ensure intercoder reliability. So here's this gives you a sense of all the different news organizations I was looking at. The leading agenda-setting newspapers, the major national TV organizations, public and commercial, and then a range of other kinds of newspapers, financial, popular newspapers, important influential newspapers like the Christian Science Monitor or Le Croix, the Catholic newspaper in France, et cetera. So I can come back to this if you're interested. So first of all, the question of who speaks. How do we measure this? And I think that Steve didn't get into all the details of some of the indicators, but I just wanted to kind of show concretely how do you begin to do this. I think ultimately when we say we're interested in who speaks and the diversity of voices, we're interested in a kind of institutional diversity, a kind of types, institutional locations. And so this is one of the ways I categorize it. I think my original coding protocol was about 40 different categories, so you can break this down in different ways. You could combine these in different ways. But what the 16 categories capture here are basically government, various kinds of government agencies and branches of government, the political parties, civil society, so bringing in trade unions, associations, religious groups, experts, business, international voices, and finally unaffiliated individuals, so the typical man or woman on the street. So drawing on this, so that's one way I measured voice. I also looked at frames, and so try to get beyond this kind of objectivity or bias framework to look at the fact that journalists are constantly making decisions about what aspects of a complex reality to emphasize. And so for any given issue, and I think this is a measure that you could use in content analysis and relating to policy that would get beyond this objectivity bias dichotomy would be using frames to look at of all the kinds of different aspects of a complex issue, which of these are emphasized. We also can look at causal frames or solution frames. We coded for looking basically, was the frame present or absent in the news package? And so that leaves the possibility of multiple frames existing in any given news story. So most news accounts do include a diversity of frames. And so then the question is, how wide is that diversity? How do you know what the frames are? Basically, in this kind of analysis, you start with a kind of wide search where you're looking at social movement information, you're looking at academics, you're looking at a range of media accounts to get a sense of what are the possible ways that any given issue could be discussed in the media. And then you can go into the media content analysis and get a sense of how much of that diversity is captured in the content, in the actual news content. So this is the category, the way we categorized immigration frames and you could dice this up in different ways, but this seemed to really capture the range of the debate, actually both in France and the United States. So looking at various kinds of victim frames, hero frames, and threat frames. So there's 10 frames here altogether. So, of course, we analyze this qualitatively as well, but I want to just show some basic kinds of quantitative ways that we use this data. So how do we measure pluralism? One way is we can just look at what is the average number of frames or speaker types per news package, so to turn it into a mean. We can also look at, and this gets at the kind of coverage as a whole, use concentration index like the Herfindahl concentration index, where you basically capture the sense of how much do one or two frames really dominate the coverage versus how much is the coverage dispersed across a range of frames. And finally, we can look in individual news packages and look at how much are opposing frames or speakers showing up in the news coverage. So in this case, we looked at how much do victim, grouping these together, victim, hero, and threat frames appear together in the same news package. So this, shows, so the first, this is looking at the speaker. So basically, we had 16 different types of speakers that could appear in the coverage. And these numbers here show the means for that across several different newspapers. So it shows that out of 16 types of speakers that could appear in any given news account, the range was really between about 3 and 6. So any given news account is not giving that full range. But there's some interesting variation across these news outlets. I can come back to the second larger number is the concentration index. And so that's a 1,000 to 10,000 index. And so the lower the number, the less concentrated it is, right? So the lower the number, the better there. Okay, so this is looking at frames. Again, some variation, but it shows that out of maybe 10 different frames that could show up in the coverage, the range is from about a little bit under 2 to about 3.5. But there is some significant variation there. And finally, this is data on balancing, so that we were looking at how much of the coverage, how many of the news packages are actually balanced in their coverage. And so, again, we see some interesting variation there. I mean, the good news is the majority of the stories do have some balance. I also wanted to look at external pluralism, and so this would be the question of across the media system as a whole, and I think this is an really important question increasingly as on the internet, as we have access to all these different news organizations online. How much diversity is there across the whole range of news organizations? So there's different ways we can measure this. On the immigration study, we looked at the average high-low percentage point gap for all 10 frames across the 10 news outlets, and that gave us some kind of indicator of external pluralism. In another study I did with Matt Powers, we looked at Danish, French, and U.S. online news, and here we were not looking at a particular issue, but at the basically the overall mix of news stories. And so there we looked at genres, authors, and topics. And so this might be a good way of trying to get at diversity across a range of news organizations without going into a particular topic. Secondly, criticism of the powerful. How do we measure this? Now, I mean, I think we often, the primary way we talk about criticism is in terms of watchdog investigative reporting. And I think it's important to emphasize that overall, very little of the news mix is investigative reporting. So this is certainly what I found in terms of the immigration issue, about 2 to 5% of the total mix of news stories. And these are page one stories, basically. This is prominent coverage, is investigative reporting. Michael Schützen and Kate Fink did a study that looked at, I think, over a 50-year period and looking at a range of types of news stories, came to a similar conclusion. I think they found that investigative reporting made up less than 2 to 3% of the overall mix. So if we're looking at investigative reporting as our primary indicator of criticism, there's very few news organizations have much at all. And so I think there's other ways that we could measure criticism. One of the ways that I measured it was looking at basically critical statements, and by that I mean specific critiques of specific targets. And so this gives some of the data just looking at the U.S. and basically on the left we have the types of criticism, and so administrative. This is, I think, captures some of that watchdog criticism, basically government implementation of policy, character, truth, ideology, policy. Basically, the majority of the critical statements are policy. So maybe that's good news. In terms of the targets, we see that government is the primary target of criticism here, and it's important to kind of, here you see the dominant right is, and so by this I mean the Republican Party in the U.S. Is also the target of a lot of criticism, but this is also a function of the particular time period. I also looked at the early 1990s when the Clinton administration was in power, and it was the dominant left and the government. So basically, the party in power and the government tend to be the primary targets of criticism. Yeah, can I just, a few more, okay. So I wanted to make two more points, okay. So one is, where do we find these various aspects of quality? And I want to emphasize, I don't think it's random. It's not, it's patterned. I mean, yes, it's a continuum. There's all kinds of exceptions, but the research suggests that there clearly are some patterns in terms of what kind of media tend to give us the highest quality in terms of pluralism and criticism, just to take those two. The research, especially bringing in the international research, I think the research is clear. The public media, taxpayer-supported media, public service broadcasting tends to provide higher quality than commercial media. And so we look at the BBC, we look at German public broadcasting in Scandinavia, et cetera, that they tend to provide more public affairs information, more diverse range of voices and viewpoints, and that public media are just as critical and often more critical of government and business. And so that's definitely confirmed by my study with Matt Powers. Also, James Curran has done a number of studies with Chantal Iyengar and others. So what about within commercial media? I think there's clearly, and I think some of Steve's research has shown this, there's clearly differences among different types of commercial media. And the primary dividing line, Steve was alluding to that, is between privately held media companies and publicly traded companies. And so if we think about the top, the kind of the most important news organizations in this country in terms of winning Pulitzers and the quality of journalism they've provided, it tends not to be random. They tend to be privately held companies where they can resist some of these profit pressures. I think this is a telling quote from the example of Knight Ridder, which was also a quality media conglomerate, but had the unfortunate, unfortunately had a publicly traded ownership form. And so the day after, this is in the late 1980s, I believe, the day after they won 7 Pulitzer Prizes, the stock price declined 16%. And the head of Knight Ridder called up a stock analyst and said, what's going on here? He says, you win too many Pulitzers. The money you spent on those projects should have been left to fall to the bottom line. So I think we need to have this conversation. Finally, in terms of nonprofit civil society, and that's really there's been an explosion of this kind of media, and I think it's a good thing because it really has different kinds of virtues. Studies have shown, the Knight study showed that nonprofit media tend to invest more of their money into editorial, into public affairs reporting than commercial media. Of course, that's a relative commitment, but even in some cases that relative commitment can translate into a greater absolute commitment. And so I think the San Diego media market is an interesting case. You look at the Voice of San Diego, which I think has maybe 10, 15 reporters, and the San Diego Union Tribune, which is a much bigger operation. Well, the Voice of San Diego clearly has more investigative reporters than the Union Tribune. Some recent studies have shown that civil society media tend to be more partisan. But again, bringing that back to democratic theories, that may be a good thing in terms of contributing to greater external pluralism of the media system. And I'm just going to wrap up with a final point, because I think that there are also some factors that contribute to quality across different types of media organizations. One is, and this is really was drawn out by my comparison of the French and the U.S. media, was looking at news formats and the way that different kinds of news formats can facilitate quality in different ways. And the second aspect is audience demographics. So I don't really have time to go into this, but I really found that in one of the big differences between the U.S. and France was the U.S. had a kind of narrative, long-form journalism that we know this is well known in the U.S., but I think this is really distinctive and not necessarily the same way that journalism is carried out in Europe. So that the virtues of that, you get these incredible, in-depth portraits of the lived experience, often of marginal groups that aren't given voice otherwise, and this really is the case in immigration reporting. But on the other hand, with the kind of multi-genre format that you have in France, you have a real mixing of news and commentary that encourages a kind of complexity to the coverage that provides a more comprehensive, multifaceted aspect to the coverage. And this really contributed, I found, to greater frame diversity, greater speaker diversity in the French coverage. And when that happened in the U.S., it also contributed to greater ideological diversity in the U.S. coverage as well. The other, I can come back to this if you're interested. But the other aspect, in terms of consistent patterns across news organizations, is that the kinds of audiences for different news outlets really kind of affects the kinds of news that's provided, and we can map that onto various indicators of quality. And so when we look at the audiences, I draw here on Pierre Bourdieu's work in distinction and thinking about audiences in terms of the kind of capital they have, not just the economic capital in terms of their income, but their cultural capital in terms of their education and profession. And we can get this kind of data. I was able to get this for my book on French and U.S. immigration news, various kinds of reader composition studies. And there was a kind of consistent finding that those news organizations with audience with the highest cultural capital tended to be those that provided news highest in pluralism and critique. So in France, the newspaper Libération, in the U.S., the Christian Science Monitor, also PBS. And it's not, I don't think it's an accident. And these numbers here are basically indexes. So 100 would be, even with the national population. A 300 score would be, okay. So, just to conclude in terms of the formats and these audience effects, multi-genre coverage increases frame and speaker diversity, whereas long-form narrative facilitates in-depth reporting and recuperation of voices from the margins, and higher cultural capital of audiences increases frame and speaker diversity. So I think that shows that the challenge today in the online environment is how to circulate high-quality news beyond these audiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Benson, for providing that situation of quality journalism in the international arena, giving us a nuanced sense of the dynamics of democracy as well as the economic forces that shape quality journalism. So I'm delighted to introduce our final panelist. Gracie Lawson-Borders is Dean of the School of Communications and professor in the Media, Journalism, and Film Department at Howard University. Her leadership, though, reaches far beyond Howard University. She's a leader in the field who is serving as an editorial board member for the International Journal on Media Management. She's a board member as well of the Howard Journal of Communications. She's a leader in AEJMC and an advisory board member for blackpaths.org. She's held a variety of offices in other organizations that reach far beyond journalism and communication, including Habitat for Humanity. Her scholarship is important in this arena as well. Her book, Media, Organizations, and Convergence, Case Studies on Media Convergence Pioneers, focuses on the work of the process as well as the concept of convergence in this arena. She's also working on a book on the business models, the economic models that are reshaping the field. She's contributed to a variety of journals. Her teaching and research come together in teaching about media management, emerging digital technologies, social media, and beyond. And she brings a rich background in the practice of journalism as well, having previously been a journalist working for the Akron Beacon Journal, the Oakland Press, and the Chicago Tribune. So we're delighted to welcome you this morning.
Good morning. Katie's going to help me make sure I do this right on someone else's computer. So I'm coming from a perspective that I think ties into a little bit of what you've been hearing this morning, and hopefully will be a part of the conversations we'll be having all day today, because that's what I hope to do, is to listen and learn. So I'm doing a little bit of what I call some reflections, and which it is just some analysis of things I think may be occurring with our discussion of quality journalism, and particularly in this digital age. One of the things that John mentioned, that I'm trying to write a book. Well, you really try to write a book when you're dean. I'm like, I got half of it done. I don't know, maybe by the time I get out of this deanship, I'll get the whole thing finished. But I start with this premise of there's something going on out there that we need to pay attention to, because we shouldn't let technology and the digital dynamic make ourselves get away from it. And one of the first things, I believe Joanna's here, and I used the title of her report from 2010 to kind of get me started thinking about this. What is quality journalism and how can it be saved? She's back there. We can ask her questions about that report. But I kind of use it as my launch pad to say that there's certain questions that make us think and come up with a lot of different answers. So following some of what Steve said, most of these elements come from the Society of Professional Journalists, mission statements, different things you've run into when people talk about what their institution or their organization stands for. So I don't have to go into detail on them, but one of them I put my asterisk by is judgment, because I think judgment is playing a little role in here more and more, that some of the things I'm going to use as an example that you know about, I think judgment plays a big role in what may or may not have happened. So Jill Abramson with this quote of, people don't crave just information, they seek judgment from someone they can trust who can ferret out information. So you're supposed to be supplying something that you took the time to use some of those elements we think about in terms of what you decide to do or not do. And most of you who have taught the ethics class know we're often telling everybody that just because you can do something, you can clone a sheep, doesn't mean you clone the sheep. So kind of making people think about that. So I think judgment is playing a role in some of the things that we're seeing because people are not necessarily keeping everything together. And I think this can come from working journalists as well as those of us who are educators in higher ed, thinking about that. Next thing is, I looked at one study that I thought was interesting, and Meyer did this study, and she said, well, let's take the audience perspective. If you want to know if you're doing something that's touching and hitting, she did a secondary analysis of about 9 quality journalism studies that were out there, and she kind of came away with this takeaway of about 3 shifts in what journalism should be doing. And you have heard this morning already, and I know today we'll probably hear more, and it'll make our conversation even richer. Just saying them quickly: participation, representation, presentation. It means something to people if they're on the other end, particularly now with all the information they get that comes from everywhere. I recall a movie I saw years ago where a woman was sitting at the table and she's looking and she says, what am I supposed to do with all of this information? It's coming everywhere. You know, it's on your phone, it's on the television, it's in the newspaper, it's on your tablet. And so she talks about if we look at quality from a perspective of the audience, maybe we do more to think about how they want to be involved. How do we keep them participatory in what we're doing? How do you look at them from, are they represented? When we talk about marginal groups, when we talk about groups that are usually not having a voice in what's covered in their community, in their city, in their county. We saw some of that recently in Ferguson, Missouri, when people saying, you're not hearing our voices. You know, what levels of those platforms are we not making sure we give some representation? And then presentation, which we can do so differently now in terms of how people use their media. And so I am a print girl, so I am still going to read a newspaper. I am going to pick up a newspaper no matter where I'm at, but I like technology, so I am going to get it on that phone as well as I'm going to look on the tablet. But some people are saying, I went one way and you need to give me that information there. Some people are saying you still need to give it to me on television. So we have these multiple platforms, and are we using them in ways that help us get to people? So I think that's food to think about. And so, again, when she says attentive listening to news users make clear that they don't want jazzing up. So they're just not looking for something to look pretty and ooh and ah, because I think the technology is seductive, and it does that. Somebody says if I can do something fancy on the web page, they'll pay attention. But I think people want something substantive, and we have to remember that when we talk about these elements of quality. I think that comes into play. So what I did is I went looking for something that I could have a little focus of mine on this whole digital situation. And this came out of the Times-Picayune deciding to go with 3 days of publication. And you know they're not the only print organization that decided to do that, but in 2012 they did. And they came with NOLA.com. So they said, we think we can do a better job if we kind of take this digital focus, and that's where they went. Well, a professor down at Tulane, Vicki Meyer, in her media analysis course, which I'm always excited when professors get their students to get involved in their research, they decided to study and see if there was a difference in quality on digital platforms versus in print, something that Steve mentioned and I thought was kind of interesting because I do think it's the new frontier of trying to figure out what we're doing digitally. Well, what they came up with, and I'm sure you know NOLA.com is not interested in what they came up with, is they thought that on the digital platform, things came out a little softer, less well-sourced, not as many sources used, and poor quality news. And what they did was they decided they would look at the print paper in 2011 before they changed over. Then they would look at it in 2013 and kind of get a year after they changed, and they would compare the print and the digital presentation. And so for those 2 years, they decided to pick 3 random days and look at page 1 and look at A1, and they kind of did the same thing on the screen. Now, of course, the media outlet came back and said, well, you know, I think your study is flawed because you really didn't look at the digital outlets 24 news cycle, because we got the tablet, we've got the phone, we've got the web, and so your measurement is a little off, and then because you didn't kind of catch it all day long, but we can't generalize from this, but I thought there was something interesting. And so what I did was pull some of the things that they came out with, and so when they said they found that the news on the digital platform tended to be softer, was that they weren't seeing as many public affairs, traditional hard news, what's going on in the city council, what's going on with the state, what's going on with police coverage, but they were seeing more entertainment, sports, lifestyle type stories. Now, granted, there is an audience for that as well, but we also know when we go back and talk about it from a democratic perspective, you also need to know public affairs information around yourself. So I stole a graphic, and I give him credit for this. Silverman put this graphic up. So he gave us a look at how the print coverage was in 2011. About 70% of it was hard news, and about 9% of it was soft news. When they completed this study, and again, we can't generalize, but I think it gives us wonderful dialogue about how to start measuring that quality issue when we look at digital platforms. You skip to 2013, and you look at print, and it's doing about 72% hard news, about 10% soft news. But when you look at the website, and I didn't pull up anything on the tablet, the phone, I just gave you a copy of the web, you'll look at hard news, about 51%, soft news about 37%. So from the visual, you can see from that graphic that there is a switch in what's being covered by the same company. So that's what I enjoyed about this particular study is Times-Picayune and their digital presence. So why was something kind of happening a little different in what was occurring in the coverage? So I think that's something for us to think about and say, what does it mean? So in my movement in this, I decided today, 2014, a documentary came out about the New York Times and Jason Blair plagiarism scandal. And Macarena Hernandez said this quote when I was sitting there looking at that movie, and I really like it. The only thing you have as a journalist is trust, and it is a very fragile trust, which is part of the title of the movie. So if we're going to talk about what quality means and the types of information and content being shared, we have to step back and say, you know, what is journalism doing to make sure that it's not slipping away from that trust, that public trust, that trustworthiness, and that truth. And so I decided to talk about some breaches in quality journalism. I'm not going to go into these in details because you know what they are, and hopefully we'll do more today. But the Rolling Stone article, we know the debacle that turned into, someone who's saying a very sensitive topic. Most of you who are on campuses know that we've been pressed by the Justice Department to really look at sexual assault and domestic violence on our campuses. And so when someone publishes a story like this, we're all tuned into it, trying to get an understanding of what may or may not have occurred. When we look at Brian Williams' situation of him talking about his coverage in 2003 and the embedded journalist, which I had a little problem with that anyway, and the story seemed to shift every time he would tell it through the years to the point a lot of these military veterans were out there just stirring because they weren't seeing what they thought they should see. The next thing, the New York Magazine with the whiz kid 17-year-old, apparently the reporter Pressler didn't push real hard enough to say if he's making that much at 17, I can't be the only one that is attracted to this story. And you know, here we go with another fabricated story. So I'm going to move through these really quickly because we can talk more today as we get these presentations because it's always, you know, good fodder to talk of examples we can stand back. But Walter Cronkite, I think, set a high standard for trustworthiness. And so when Brian Williams, you know, tried to apologize and said, I misremembered or things like that, his hole kept getting deeper and deeper and deeper. Because really what people were looking at is, you're sitting on NBC Nightly News each night, and we trust what you are saying. We believe in what you're saying. Apparently, he was so believable that he was around about the 23rd most trusted person in the country, and that fell real fast after he apologized in February to about 8:35, where, you know, if you look at things like that for a little fun, it sort of says, Brian, something happened there. Jessica Pressler, you know, again, 17-year-old, provocative story, very interesting, could have been a very good story. It could have even been a story about what not to do when you're looking at something. But I thought it was interesting. The New Yorker's response was, we were duped. But I think that they needed to have a little bit more of a response than that if what we're talking about today with quality journalism. What more can you do proactive than to end up with just that? But the Rolling Stone one is one I know we'll talk about more today as we see presentations today. And that is, you know, we have this very lengthy article touching into a very sensitive subject, in particular for those of us academics that are sitting on campuses right now. Reporter apologizes to us, says, you know, hate this happened. You know, of course, since Columbia Journalism Graduate School report came out the other day, many people debate why Sabrina didn't lose her job. Somebody's head didn't roll because the quality journalism was breached. The report talked about all the flaws that it saw in the reporting, the editing, the supervision. If I had a chance to put something in there, I would say, and then the judgment about what to do with that story, especially the topic and how to do it. And so they kind of came up with this kind of this whole thing blowing up makes us pause and do what we are fortunate to do today and talk about really what journalism credibility means to us and what should be happening, what we should be teaching and preparing young people in academia, what we should be doing out there as working journalists in the community, what we want to see happen and not see slip away. It means we have to pay a little bit more attention to it. So that was the only reason I brought those up. So in my own subjective way, because I'm looking at the paying for quality journalism perspective myself and my research, I just picked 2 sites, and these are subjective, and they're just me saying, well, what are they trying to do a little bit different in their arena? ProPublica, as you know, was founded by Paul Steiger, and their whole point as a nonprofit is to say we want to bring, good quality journalism. We want to do investigative journalism. That's their description of it. We want to, and they really are. They're open to people. They've got the common license. They want you to use their articles and republish them, and they run their My Top News story. And if you look at their website, they're constantly trying to draw you in as an audience to give me your feedback. What do you think about this? Here's the stories that we've got a lot of traction on. And so there's a lot of engagement with our audience. And when they won those 2 Pulitzer Prizes, it kind of said something about this upstart digital outlet. What are they tapping into? What are they using and talking about? And arguably, you may have a different perspective, but I'm just using them as an example. Same thing I did with Cricky, because I'm always trolling around for these examples of what people are doing and how they're paying for it. This particular case, nonprofit. And what they say they stand for. Take you over to Cricky website in Australia. Same thing. The editor there was working for one of Rupert Murdoch's media outlets and kind of got fed up in 2000 and decided to start this alternative independent website. And so what they do is say in their arena, they want to, again, look at trying to bring coverage of things that they felt like a lot of governmental coverage wasn't occurring in the country, and they wanted to move that. Okay. So I'm going to move forward real quickly. They celebrate their 15th year this year. They have a quality journalism project where they're trying to look at Australian journalists to say, tell me what you think are examples of quality journalism. And every Wednesday, that's what they have. They have someone featured talking about what they see and what they think about. Another thing that I wanted to, using someone else's, is paying for quality journalism real quick, because I think this is important too, because it costs to do investigative journalism. It costs to do international coverage. It even costs to cover your local community. And so we know some of the things are out there. And Slate, who started out the gate really early before some of the others in 1996, tried to look at ways that the internet could let you provide good journalism. And they have done some of the things that most of us know that others are doing now, the aggregating of news, the blogs, the slideshows, the video. They really were some people who set that early tone of what we may do in that arena. But the other things that we have to look at is, how do you monetize some of this? One of the things you have to do is money has to be considered. The budget has to be considered. Wall Street Journal, of course, with the paid subscription from the day they went out the gate. But the other things that people are doing, some paywall, some saying paywall with a little access. With New York Times, I think 10 a month. Some are saying, I'll give you access, but I'm going to come up with other special things that you'll pay for. But other revenue streams are needed in the outlets out there, as Steve says, in order to pay for this quality journalism once we define what we want it to be. And so if I fast forward to wrap up, I'd say extending the lens from my perspective means it needs to be embedded and internalized that quality journalism should be seen as a value and in practice, and that in order to not have those breaches of journalism become a norm, which we truly should not want even in this digital environment, then we've got to value it enough and keep it in practice enough that that's how we're looking at it. So whether on a campus or whether you're out there being trained as a working journalist. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dean Lawson-Borders, for helping bring us forward this question of quality journalism into the digital age, as well as raising the question of judgment, which I think in some ways incorporates the idea of ethics and where does that fit into quality. So we now have about about 12 minutes, according to that clock, for Q&A. So let me start the brilliant opening presentation. Let me start this part of the conversation with a question that really hasn't, I think, implications, but hasn't been touched upon so much in the technological arena. Professor Bradish, in his opening comments, talked about how our program used to have the element of human communication. Well, as we look at some of the things that are happening, as organizations in the media try to become more cost-effective, we see the rise of algorithms and automation in both reporting, like QuakeBot at the LA Times, and actual writing of stories. Narrative Science has many paying media clients. Also, the AP now produces thousands of stories a year, mostly on business, but this is spreading into other arenas. What are your thoughts, any of the panelists, about the role of algorithms, data, coding, all of that as quality journalism is at stake? Will this improve the quality? Will it affect it in any way? Is it relevant?
Okay. One of the big problems with using algorithms is that they sometimes confuse attention with value and importance. I like to look at aggregators, so I do Google and Yahoo, and I'm almost reluctant now to read a particular type of story because that means all I will get is that. Unfortunately, not unfortunately, the baseball has started. I'm happy it started, but I looked up the Tigers the other day, and now all I get on Yahoo are Tiger stories, and that's not why I go to aggregators. So it's a tool that can be useful, but it's not always used in a way that serves, I think, the people who access it.
Thank you. Any other comments, or should we open up the floor?
I just say the same thing. It gets back to the judgment, because it does mean we're tapping on something, but it doesn't mean that that's what's the quality. It just could be the curiosity, or, I know Steve likes the Tigers, and so he's going to go there. But I think we have to seek the judgment in the decision-making in those different outlets in terms of, again, what gets the emphasis, not just what the numbers. We know big data is a part of everybody's conversation now, but I think you've got to give meaning to what that data is showing you.
Just to build on that, I don't think it's really a question of algorithms in general, but how different news organizations are using it. So it's New York Times is using them in one way, and BuzzFeed's using them in another way. And so I think it gets back to the question of the kind of business models, the funding, the ownership of the different kinds of news organizations, and what kind of patterns that we can see in terms of who's really offering the best practices. I think we need to do a lot more systematic research in terms of trying to look for who's doing the best journalism, and is it a coincidence, or what is something about the way the organization is managed in terms of the kinds of incentives that are set up in terms of the funding model or the ownership model. I think we have to pay attention to that more closely.
Thank you. Well, let's open it up to the floor for questions. We have a microphone. We're going to use the microphone. And please introduce yourself, just briefly, your name, and if there's an organization, and then ask your question.
Hi, I'm Tara George. I'm a professor of journalism from Montclair State University. Dr. Lacy, as you were trying to define journalism earlier, I was reminded of Justice Potter Stewart's quote,
I know it when I see it.
I know it when I see it. He, of course, was trying to define pornography. Have we, as journalists, reached the point where we need to define what quality journalism is? Has it gotten to the point where so much of it needs to be put up on the top shelf and out of reach and covered in a paper bag? Is it more a question of we all know what quality journalism is. The question is, how can we do it?
Yeah, I think there's a fairly strong consensus among people who teach and produce journalism as to what quality means. Now, there have been some studies that find some variation between people who run big metro dailies and people who run weeklies. And I've run weeklies and worked at the suburban dailies, et cetera, and there are some different things that you have to do. But the reality is this: not every member of the audience is interested in quality journalism. 23 years ago, we put out an edition newspaper research journal that was what's happening in the transition of newspapers, but it was about the impact of cable, not the internet. The internet came later, of course, and more. And there was an article in there by a guy named Bill Blankenberg, who did work on public ownership, is now retired. And it was about, are newspapers a class or a mass medium? And he ended with a question mark, but my feeling is then and now that newspapers, anything textual, is really an elite medium. A lot of people don't read very well in this country. So we know, I think, what journalism is. I think we can translate it into measures, and we can use that. But the reality is not everybody wants that, and that's a reality that we or journalists can't change. Public education or education might, but that's a different realm.
Other questions? You're going to get a good workout here.
Hi, I'm Ashley Muddiman. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Wyoming, and I think my question builds quite well, I think, off the last one. Who should define quality journalism? Should this be something that, and this is open to anybody, do you think this is something that each news organization needs to define for themselves? Should academics be trying to push a specific definition? Should journalism professionals try to be doing that kind of thing? Or who do you think should be doing this defining for journalist organizations?
Well, I guess, I would say we don't have to make some decision about like one measure of quality. I think there's multiple measures, but I think it's clear that certain kinds of journalism that we've traditionally defined as quality are in danger and are being underproduced. And so we need to, I think the discussion is really how to get more of that into the mix, right? Because I think there's certain kinds of soft news that's going to get produced, and we don't have to really worry about that, right? So you were talking about ProPublica and some of the work that some of the nonprofits are doing. Well, it's really fragile. I mean, ProPublica is not a market actor. It's not sustainable in the market. It's supported by some wealthy philanthropists who've committed to keeping this thing going. And so I think a lot of the top journalism right now, investigative journalism, there's several outlets like that and networks that contribute journalism to mainstream organizations. They're relying on philanthropy, on whatever little advertising they can get. They're just really barely making it. And I think that's a public policy question. We should think about how do we make it easier for them to sustain themselves through tax incentives, through maybe direct subsidies, through training. I mean, whatever it takes to kind of keep them going, because a lot of them are not going to transition to the market, and we have to be realistic about that. But they're doing something that's not going to be done otherwise.
And I think defining it has to be collaborative, because I think you have to think about the dynamic of the environment we have now because of the digital age. That term may sound trite to us, but it really does matter in terms of the way people can access information. And so in different communities, for different individuals, as Steve says, how they're going to see quality and value it is going to vary, but I think it has to be a combination of hearing and listening, which is, I think, the point that in Meyer's study she was making from the audience perspective is you have to be attentive to what the audience is looking for as well, too. There are going to be always people who just want to, read about, dolphins speaking to humans just as well as someone who wants to read about crickets speaking to humans. But there's some of us who want to know public affairs information, and we want to know information that we can trust to help us make a decision about how we operate within our society. What I would really like to see is more things now kind of trying to get us a sense of that, like the study, the Times-Picayune, where they go back and look at that, and others try to see what are we doing in this fast-paced 24/7, and are we paying attention to how we try to create that wave where that is more of a continuum versus one is up and one is down, but you have a flow, and then you have a better sense of what's going on in your environment around you.
Great, thanks so much. All fantastic presentations. I just want to follow up on the point, Professor Lawson, about listening, who the audience is listening. And I just wonder about extending that to questions of judging success around engagement with the news. And what possibilities there are there?
Well, I think it still goes back to this measurement question that we have, that you and I can sit on one of these laptops in here and keep hitting the same button, and someone thinks, boy, I got a lot of traction on my website today, but we're just doing nothing but sitting there hitting the button. And again, versus having some more substantive ways to talk about what does it mean, certain things that we're doing, and where do they go. We talk about the long tail. Well, one example of that is, again, I like some of the things that ProPublica does and says, please use our story again. You can use it. We want you to use it. We just don't want you to edit it or change it, but we want you to use it. So then where do we start seeing other things show up? And we get a sense of what's topic. I love the fact that there are people out there studying social media right now. For the thing is, look how new social media is. It's really not been around that long. What was it, 2004 for Facebook? So what does it mean when someone says it's trending on social media? Just what does that mean? So I think we have to have various measures, and then we have to do more than just count it. We have to start getting some sense of it so we can get a better understanding of it.
Question over here.
Hi, my name is Simon. I'm a Rutgers alum. Actually took one of Professor Pavlik's classes. It was a wonderful class. So my question revolves around the question of how you distribute the quality journalism, right? You just brought up the idea that what does trending mean on social media? On Facebook, trending means that Facebook's algorithms have determined that this is what you should see at the top of your feed. So the question then becomes is how can journalists communicate with those organizations, and how can those organizations become a part of the process of delivering quality journalism to underserved communities?
Part of this sort of expands beyond the idea of journalism to democracy and participation. I'm doing a project now with a friend of mine. We've gone back and looked at a book called The People's Choice, which was one done by Lazarus Felt about the 1940 election. It was the foundation for a lot of the theory that we have. And the interesting thing is it's a classic. It's often cited and seldom read because there are lots of things in there. They sort of assumed that the only role of media was to change minds, to convert people from one position to another. What they found is most people, it reinforces. And that's not a bad thing necessarily. I mean, if you have a group, if you're a Republican, you want to reinforce the Republicans. If you're a Democrat, et cetera. So throughout history, we as academics have not studied the range of things that media could do. And so we talk about it in isolation of interpersonal communication, mediated or not, our family influence. To really understand media and its impact on democracy, you have to look at the whole thing. And what does media do? And what is it the digital distribution will do that wasn't happening before, that may be better or worse or whatever? So to some degree, we haven't studied it as well as we can, and I hope as well as we do, because we limit ourselves with our definitions and our approaches. A lot of this is to some degree empirical. We do not know well, and in tracking clicks and visits and even engagement, it's not going to tell us why people engage. That's a different issue, and that's the issue that you have to solve to understand what you can do well in terms of quality.
Well, Phil, are we out of time now?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on this. It's such an interesting question. There was a researcher who we weren't able to get here today who's done some just interesting research lately, going to tech companies, interviewing the algorithm designers who are involved in this distribution process, essentially, the people who help design the algorithms that determine whether the news does or does not get put in front of us. And every one of them had the exact same response. We don't really see ourselves as journalism. And when they were asked questions about journalistic values and things like that, they would say, we don't really understand these questions you're asking us, and we don't think anybody else would either. And it was so troubling to think about this, the process of news distribution now being one at which the news values reflected in how journalists produce the news, suddenly hitting this interesting, new, intermediary where none of these values are at work in the process by which the news reaches us. And so, when we think about now that, as so many of you probably know, Facebook is proposing to all news outlets, how about you just host all your news on Facebook? And we just take you sort of out of the equation even further. It does get a little troubling when we know that really a lot of these news values we're talking about today haven't begun to really seep into a lot of the platforms design that we all use to access news.
All right, well, we're about out of time, so we have a lot more exciting program today, so please join me in thanking our opening panelists.